Hi, Ted, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
Hello. Hi.
So, I'm really looking forward to diving in deep on sociocracy, and you're here in your capacity as founder of Sociocracy for All. So, some of the people listening to this might not be familiar with the idea of sociocracy. So, how do you tend to describe it to people who haven't come across it before?
Yeah, I guess the short version that I typically use is just basically the translation of the word because it means those who associate together decide together. So we want to empower people who work together on something to also be the ones making the decisions about how it's done and where they put their priorities and so on. So it is really opposed to hierarchical organizing where somebody who's your supervisor, your boss, that makes the decisions about what should be important to you and how you do things, but instead it's the people who are actually working on something. So it's a very peer-oriented approach. That's really what it is.
Well, it sounds good to me as a corporate refugee myself. Having more autonomy sounds definitely like the way to go. So, just to get some idea of the scale of sociocracy at the moment, is this a real thing that's happening in the world? Are organizations adopting this? And if so, what kind of organizations?
You know, it's funny. Sociocracy is a little all over the place in terms of how it's used. When I got involved with the sociocracy world a few years ago, I would have answered this question differently. Actually, I would have said, "Yeah, it's really in use in some organizations." Back then, it was very much in alternative spaces, like for example, intentional communities and so on. And that's no longer true. It's now becoming something that is actually not as hippie and sort of out there as it used to be, as people are catching more on to horizontal organizing in general. So right now it is very real and very much used in still intentional communities, but also any kind of organization that cares about horizontal organizing. It might be for-profits, it might be non-profits, um, any kind of yeah, for example, schools, and it actually also has some roots in schools, so that is not a big surprise. Yeah, so right now there's hardly any sector where at least something remotely in that area is not using sociocracy. It's not the case, that people off the street might be aware of it, but people who look into governance systems typically come across sociocracy as one of the things that are the options out there now.
So, that's great to hear that it's catching fire. What does it actually look like? So most of us will be familiar with what a top-down hierarchical organization looks like, but how does it work?
So the whole point about it is that we tend to decentralize decisions, right? So if let's say we have an organization of let's say 40 or 50 people. Those 40 or 50 people all do different things, right? And instead of one boss or middle management telling people what to do, we put in more we have people self-organize into teams that we call circles. And those circles then become like semi-autonomous cells that do their own thing. So, for example, if you let's say have an organization that does outreach, like PR kind of things, then the PR circle might be a circle of let's say four, five, six people that then really decide themselves how they and like how they do outreach or how they do PR and how they go about it, what they find important in that, and so on. And we give that group full autonomy to do it in whatever way they want to. While then there might be a team that is working on content production, for example, and they do their own thing. And then there is a way of connecting those groups, so and nesting them just the way, let's say, a tree is built, like a leaf as part of a branch, as part of the tree, as part of a forest, as part of an ecosystem. So we use the same kind of nesting method for circles. So like PR might be part of something bigger, or let's say social media might be a subset of PR. So things out there in the world have a natural order to them, right? And like subset relationships that don't mean that now, let's say a tree, like in a natural hierarchy, doesn't boss their leaves around, right? But there is like a part of relationship. So it's not coercive power, but just what are you a bigger part of? So in that sense, those circles are autonomous pieces of the whole, and they work together to make the whole thing happen through linking that I can say more about. But one big piece about it is also that it's very much peer-oriented in that those teams make decisions by consent, so they only move forward um, on decisions if everybody on the team can say yes, that's something that I can get behind. So that you really have that horizontal angle to the organization, so that people who actually know each other and know what they're talking about can really decide, but together as a collective. Those are, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, after you, please.
Yeah, there's, I guess maybe I'm going to say something about linking here, because sometimes it sounds, when I tell the story like that, sometimes people think it's basically a chaotic bunch of teams doing things. But really what then happens is that you have those small groups that then, as I said, belong to a next bigger group, and they send two people to the next bigger group, so that that parent circle, if that's what I would call it, will then know what's happening on all those smaller levels and so on, so that everything is still connected. So it's a very orderly way for very flexible organizing, and that's kind of a cool combination, that you can be very flexible and very autonomous, and yet you have a lot of coherence in the system because people are connected and telling each other and have that sense of alignment with each other.
Yeah, I really love the image of the tree and that sort of natural biomimetic imagery around that. So we've probably all been in meetings or committees, or heck, in families, where we're trying to get everybody to agree on one thing, and it's a lot harder than it sounds. So how does that work in sociocracy? How do you get a whole circle to agree when you don't have somebody at the top handing down their strategy like a decree from God?
Yeah, exactly. Well, one thing is that this works best in mission or in purpose-driven organizations. So if you know why you're there, that is a big unifier, right? Because then you have that shared purpose. That's what you're all about. That's what you all care about, right? So and then that translates into what are we doing in this particular group. So, for example, again, content production circle, they will have a stated aim of producing content about whatever it's about. And then that is the unifier. So instead of having a boss that aligns us, because we're all equals under this boss, instead we're all there for that shared purpose. So, and that also then becomes the backdrop in how we make decisions. So, for example, if I bring a proposal and say, hey, I have a plan here, I have a project I want to do, we will evaluate that compared to the backdrop of what our shared purpose is. Like, does this match what we said we would do? Does it in some way create an obstacle with what we said we would do? So it's all agreement based, right? Because those aims that we state are agreements that we make with each other and with the other circle, so that it all matches. So then that's how we evaluate the proposal. And the cool thing about that, what is something that I really deeply love about consent decision making in sociocracy, is the following. If now we have a circle, let's say, again, content production having this aim, and everybody who's in that circle signs up for the aim, basically, that's why they're there, right? And now I have a proposal. Let's say somebody says, oh, no, actually, I can't go along with that because it's going to create this negative side effect somewhere else that actually keeps us from doing what we said we would do. Then as soon as that objection is made, we don't have a dynamic of us versus them, or that person against the other, or that person's the naysayer, because what unifies us is the shared purpose. So we're all, I always say, like, we're all in the camp of wanting to achieve what we said we would do, right? So all we need to do is together find a way to improve the proposal so that we can achieve our aim. So we're not falling into camps or into factions as much, right? Because we know what we're there for and we know how to make decisions together. So that's one big aspect of how consent and objections work in relationship to that shared aim. Another big piece that is important to me is that a lot what happens in hierarchical organizations is that you might be heard, but you don't read your content production circle, to say in that example, you actually are a decision maker. So it's that changes how the conversation goes in the first place, because some people have this tendency to just complain but not actually do, but that's not an option in this kind of system, because you're it, right? You're the circle that calls the shots on that particular topic. So it's much more likely that people step up into a place of self-responsibility and really keeping in mind the whole team and that purpose. Another aspect is that we tend to hear people the first time. So often in horizontal organizing, right, you throw out an idea and you might think it's a good idea, but doesn't really get heard. Or even worse, somebody repeats your idea and then gets the credit, and all those dynamics. What we do is we talk in rounds quite a bit. And what we mean by that is that, let's say we gather ideas or like solutions to a particular problem, and we will go one by one by one. So all, let's say, 6 people in the room speak one by one. And that sounds slow and tedious, but really what happens is that it sort of slows down to what I would call a human pace, so that you actually start to listen to each other, right? Instead of sitting at the edge of your seat, right, waiting to jump in with that other cool idea that you have, right, you actually listen to what is being said. Like, you're not in the future or in the past, you're actually in the moment. So you listen to each other, and that's where things can then really happen. The good thing is, if you co-create and you listen to each other respectfully and really giving each other space in the first place, you don't experience as much backlash if somebody does have a proposal, right? So you're starting out from a whole different place than if you're not being heard. And then, of course, that builds some trust and respect and just better relationships over time, and that also helps the decision making. So when it's sometimes hard to do like direct comparisons, I guess, right? Because it's not just about how do you integrate an objection, get to consent, right? It's about the whole ecosystem. How do you build an ecosystem that actually helps people show up as their better selves and really, like from the get-go, have a whole different collaborative culture compared to what people are typically used to.
Yeah, it sounds really brilliant for inclusion of those voices. It reminds me of that cartoon. I don't know if you've seen it, where there are people sitting around a board table and someone saying, "That's a great idea, Miss Tiggs. Now maybe one of the men can come up with it." You know, I think every woman
Yes.
who's worked in a corporate context can relate to that. Um, and it's also making me think about employee engagement, because it always breaks my heart just a little bit when, or quite a lot actually, when the Gallup figures come out about employee disengagement. And these surveys are done across 48 countries, and it's normally something like 85% of employees are either disengaged or not engaged or actively disengaged, meaning they're actually trying to undermine their employer in some sense. And I've been one of those disengaged employees. So it just breaks my heart that so many human hours are being wasted watching the clock, waiting for escape time. So it sounds like this giving people a lot more say and autonomy can only be a good thing for employee engagement, which surely has to be a good thing for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, doesn't that all make sense? Yeah, it's actually hard to unthink it once. Yeah, and it's interesting sometimes, I have these discussions with people that just don't want to, I guess, accept what you just said. They just are so much in the frame of efficiency means telling people what to do. And they don't, I guess they're somewhat oblivious to all the downstream effects of that, right? Like the study that you quoted. And for example, just this tiny, tiny thing that I talked about, like, yes, it sounds like hearing people one by one would take up time. And then people say, that's not efficient, like, yeah, but creating a power over culture where people basically check out and are like, as you're saying, actively undermining the organization. How's that effective? Like, it's just, we have to look at the whole mix, and it sometimes seems like an unfair comparison, right? To go like, yeah, telling people what to do is efficient in the moment. And overall, it's not a useful strategy. It's simply not sustainable over time. And I know, for example, a story, just one anecdote, and we experience that in our own organization as well. That is, of course, run so Socratically. But this is a story from a school where they were, of course, hit by COVID, like like everybody, and then so many of the changes required that they had to do adjustments that they had to do to satisfy regulations and so on, um, were really had well, basically people had to come up with ideas and plans and whatever in extra time. Like that time didn't magically appear, but people were willing to put in that time because just previously they had established circles and so on. So now people had the sense of ownership of this is, like, I am part of the circle and this is what we do, this is what we're responsible for. So saying, oh, that's none of my problem, and plus also my 8.5 hours are up, like, I'm going home, I don't care. That kind of thinking just disappears as people are like, no, this is important to me. I want to be here. These are my people, and this is what we do. So that it's a whole completely different situation. So yeah, engagement certainly is a huge factor in all of this.
I'm so glad that you mentioned COVID. Do you feel that sociocracy works better during times of COVID, where so many of us are having to connect virtually over Zoom or Skype or whatever? How do you see the impact of COVID on maybe the adoption of sociocracy going forwards?
Yeah, I'm wondering about that myself, I guess. Of course, we've been trying to do some guessing early on of what does it mean for us and where should we put our energy. And I haven't quite figured it out, to be honest. I guess where I would go with this is that I'm wondering if a bad meeting is put online, does that make it even less tolerable? And people would just, does it basically mean people are just not willing to accept many things that they have been willing to accept? So that's in terms of meetings. Maybe it's just that it's easier to look like you're present. If you're on the screen, I don't know. But one aspect that I'm curious about COVID or remote working in general, actually, in sociocracy, is that just the level of control isn't there anymore, right? You have to trust people more because they are somewhere completely different. And all you can do as an employer basically is cross your fingers, right? And yes, I know there have been control systems installed and so on. That's a whole different game. But I guess just overall, having to let go of control and trusting more is an interesting thing that I'm curious about and how that's going to play out long term. Maybe it is going to lead to more, um, yeah, to just a different culture where you know that if I have to trust somebody ultimately, I might as well create working conditions that make it more like easier and more likely that I can do that. That's one thing. I guess one thing also that comes up for me around all of this is just that my observation is that people's expectations of meetings are so low. Um, that's almost an obstacle for us, because people don't even have the belief that it could be better. So I never quite know what to say about that because just so much time is spent in meetings, right? And people walk, like I notice it sometimes when I am in a meeting, that I'm not running or that nobody's running. And I froze, didn't I? Nah. How long did I? Sorry about that. It's probably our internet blip.
I thought it was my internet playing up.
So anyway, so what I'm noticing is that people's expectations of meetings are so low, right? I notice that in comparison when I'm in meetings with people, meetings that I don't find particularly well planned, done, or anything, right? Like non-Socratic meetings, and then everybody seems pretty content, and that creates a little bit of an obstacle for us. Of just sometimes I just want to walk around and raise people's expectations of no, meetings can actually be connecting and productive and fun and all of that, and like have the expectation that you can be heard in a meeting. But people have basically resigned on that front quite a bit. So that's something to factor in all of that.
Wow, yeah, that's a really interesting point. That if people are used to basically, zoning out and going to their happy place during meetings, to actually shift the mindset so that they realize that there's with that extra autonomy, there's also a responsibility for them to be paying attention and contributing. It's sort of a double-edged sword, but hopefully a challenge that people will be willing to rise to, because I think ultimately we all want to feel that we're spending our time valuably, that we are contributing to something and that we're being recognized for our contribution. So hopefully that will come in time. So that brings me to my next question. Supposing there's someone listening to this and at the moment they're working in a fairly traditional hierarchical organization and they're thinking, sociocracy sounds great, trust, respect, autonomy, engagement, all beautiful words. I want to bring it into my organization. I wonder if you've got some words of warning about some of the pitfalls or challenges that they might run into trying to retrofit sociocracy into an existing organization.
Yeah. In that scenario, it really depends on who you are in that organization. Let's say you're the owner. Like, let's say you're in general just in a position of power and you could just make it happen. I guess there's so much to say. Yeah. So one aspect is that I often warn people of, well, do you actually mean it? Do you just want things to be more efficient? Like, is that it? That's not enough of a driver for me. Because then people just basically want to find another strategy of squeezing more efficiency out of people. And that's not the point, right? I mean, that might be a side effect, but it shouldn't really be the point. That, for me, would be for the wrong reasons. So often, or sometimes what I see, especially in the corporate world, is people just, wanting that as yet another strategy, although for me it's a whole different paradigm. So just doing it superficially, I have some skepticism about. So then what I challenge then typically is like, well, okay, let's say you empower a circle and the circle does something that you wouldn't have done. Well, how would you feel, right? Are you really actually willing to let go of authority? Because if not, it's probably not a good idea. You have to be able to let go, right? If you're in the position of the decision maker right now. One big pitfall, actually. So if that's all good, one big pitfall is training people. Because here's the thing. So most of us know, because we've been schooled in hierarchical situations, right? Everything, like basically, I mean, most there we go. So hierarchy is typically something that we know. Hierarchy is something that we've seen in schools, that we've seen in university if we went there, that we've seen in our families, everywhere around us. Hierarchy is something that we get accustomed to. So that's not so hard to learn. Now, and plus we don't have as much choice, right? If we're in the middle of a hierarchical chain, then basically it's fairly obvious what we need to do and what we can't do. Yet in a sociocratic system, everybody needs to understand how it works because it's decentralized, right? So, for example, if you have a group of 5 that are running the circle, they need to know how to run meetings, use consent, and all of that. How they're connected to the bigger system. So that means now that you really have to pay attention to training people and training them so well that they can actually take ownership of the system. Because in a way, even the system and how it works is something you can tweak and tailor to what you want to do. So you need to know how to do that to really do it, right? If it's just something where you go through the motion, it's not going to be the real thing, right? Because that would not be empowering. Because you also don't want to be like at the mercy of a system. So you need to be able to change anything and adjust it and so on together. So that means the focus now, instead of controlling people or micromanaging people, the focus has to be on giving people the skills and the knowledge that they need to do it themselves. And most people are actually chronically trying to get away with the least knowledge and training that they can get away with. I actually had somebody from like an owner of a company tell me like, "Oh, that's great. How can I do this without training my people?" Like, that's probably not an option, because isn't that the definition of insanity, right? And doing everything the same and expecting different results. Like, how would that work, you know? So that's a big point. I guess I'm just looking real quick whether I've talked about all the pitfalls. Not enough training is the biggest one. Not really meaning it is a big one. One aspect that I want to bring up, because I've talked more about hierarchical situations, like when you go from a hierarchical situation into a sociocratic context. But there's also the other part of it. What I like and also find tricky about sociocracy is that both sides have to learn, right? Those who are in power have to let go of power and accept that other people are making decisions about things. But the other side, people who like to refer to other people or defer to other people, and who don't want to step up, or who don't want to use systems because they just want to be like in a structureless place, they also need to change their behaviors, right? So really both sides have to basically, from like being in control to not wanting any responsibility, they have to both get to this middle place of balance. And that's not trivial. It actually changes a lot about how people think about themselves. So there's a lot of personal transformation that typically happens for people that comes along with this. You can't just, it's not something, it's not like a coat that you put on. It actually does something with you, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that is profound. And I can really see the challenges from both sides of people relinquishing power and people taking or accepting power, that it's kind of existential. People are actually having to rethink the way that they show up at work. And I guess that's where the training comes in to help with that. But it's still deep, deep work. But it also feels like it's an important shift to happen, that the way that things have worked in the past with command and control structures is not working so well anymore. That if we're going to have any hope of addressing the challenges that face all of humanity going forwards, then we need to tap into everybody's intelligence, not just the 1% who are holding the power. Is that something that you sort of think about in your? Does that resonate?
Totally. Yes. Yeah. And that's intimidating, isn't it? Because yeah, I guess it's not. Let's see. I guess with all the challenges that we have, right, they all have a systemic nature to them, right? Like, look at climate, look at, like inequality, all of that. It's not that you can just show up and say, oh, I have the solution, and then like, it's not you can't buy the solution, you know what I mean? And it's not a one solution kind of thing. All of those are systemic things that are just deeply ingrained into everything, right? So now that means the solution basically also has to be deeply ingrained into and in a decentralized way. That's what I find so appealing about self-governance, because I have a maybe naive, but I'm not sure how naive it is actually, but my belief is that if we teach people how to self-organize, they're going to be able to make a difference wherever they are, right? So it is teaching governance and self-governance in particular is like a decentralized solution that can actually make a difference on a systemic level. That's what excites me. One other aspect of that is, yeah, maybe it's along those lines of just also the space of uncertainty that we're in, right? Like so many binary or easy answers simply don't apply anymore, but nobody really knows what's going to replace it. I mean, in a way, COVID was such a great education on that one, right? I remember me and my kids, we always had these conversations, and my younger kid to wrap their head. There we go. So when my kids ask me in COVID time, when, for example, when can we go back to school, or when can we travel and see our relatives and so on? And I had to tell them that I don't know because nobody knows, because it is not known. That was hard for them to accept, right? And I could really see how we all, and how children sort of learn something that we all have to learn. Sometimes that seems to be that's the case. Um, yeah, just being facing more reality when nobody actually knows how something is going to play out. And I mean, not in 50 years, but more like in 2 months, right? So that has shifted so much. And that's one of the strengths of decentralized systems, is that they tend to be more resilient, right? So instead of like like slightly rigid and somewhat slow system, you have a system where many different entities, like units, can make changes wherever they're needed. So that's pretty powerful, and it also helps in navigating uncertainty, because you can make more small changes sort of closer to where the action is and respond faster and so on. So yeah, that's it's all one. I guess it all belongs to me into this uncertainty pattern, and going more towards a collective intelligence where easy black and white answers will not be a thing as much anymore.
Mm, love it. Yeah, I sometimes use that image of a big old-fashioned sailing ship compared with like a motor launch. The motor launch might go in a much straighter line and maybe faster, but if the engine fails, or if the skipper falls overboard and nobody else knows how to drive it, or whatever, the skipper it, then you've got a problem. Whereas with the sailboat, if you've got, you know, many sails on it, then if one of the sails rips, then you've still got the resilience, you've got redundancy, you've got other options. You can rearrange the other sails to sort of fill in the gaps. So it does feel that that the time for sociocracy is now. It feels maybe that's the reason that it's really emerging and catching on now, is because it's what the times demand.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think, yeah, I'm really in admiration. The system in itself, or the way we use it now, was invented in the late 70s, right? It just seemed like way ahead of its time, I think, back then. And I think what you're saying, I completely agree with, in that now people are noticing more and more the downsides of the systems that we do have, and just how vulnerable we are, right, in these somewhat rigid structures, and that we simply can't afford to continue. Like it's not so much about, oh, this would be better. It's really about, no, this current system is basically maxed out. Like we're hitting like we're coming towards a place where structures simply break down, and we need new systems. And I know that many people are aware of that, and they are looking for those decentralized systems and trying to make that work. So that's literally what gets me out of bed. Like no, this is something that we need now, and actually we would have needed it 5 years ago, because I wish everybody were already trained now. For example, when COVID hit, I really had this moment of, gee, like, I wish we had like everything in place, because then we could organize, like, I don't know, just all the things that we need, to just really meet basic needs for, let's say, childcare, or mutual aid systems, and all of those things, that people need organizing skills for. So whatever your projection of the future is, organizing skills will probably be needed. So that is something that we need now, and I just wish we were already ready to have it in, like, available for people on a much broader scale. But we're working on that.
Mm. Yes, working on not conquering the world, but helping the world to conquer itself.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm just thinking about what it might have been like if, for the parents who've been homeschooling their kids, if there were sociocratic circles of parents that could rapidly self-organize into circles to teach math here and biology there and history there. It could have saved a lot of stress
Yes.
potentially. Um, So, Ted, if it's okay, I'd like to switch things up a little bit now, switch gears, and maybe get a bit more sort of personal about you and your passion for sociocracy and um, how it has impacted your life, and basically why you felt moved to create sociocracy for all. So, can you tell me a little bit more about your journey into sociocracy and why it was something that just, lit your fire?
So I guess on a surface level, it's a very simple story. I moved here from Germany, and then we decided to stay here for a number of reasons, but also because we had fallen in love with an intentional community here in Western Massachusetts. And this community was run so Socratically. So that's how I got exposed to it. And I remember I had this light bulb moment where sociocracy basically rose to my attention because I was part of a circle that, I thought like, okay, like, I don't know, I knew committees from other kind of work, to me that was just the same thing. But I noticed we did a meeting evaluation at the end, and I heard myself say, wow, I'm leaving this meeting more connected, feeling more connected and more refreshed than when I came. And I thought, that's not typically what happens in meetings. What was different here? And I noticed it was, for example, the rounds and just the whole vibe of it and just the ease with which we flowed together. I was like, wow, this is cool. So then I started reading up on it and talking to the person who had brought it here. And we co-founded Sociocracy for All together. The reason we founded Sociocracy for All is because for us, this is really social change work. It's not just something that you bring to an organization, as I said earlier. It's not something that you just bring there to boost efficiency. That to me, that's interesting, but that's not transformative, right? And it's the transformative nature that I find really fascinating of giving people the gift of being able to manage their own things and just having that level of autonomy for people. And ultimately creating spaces that are more inclusive for everybody, because our current systems, so many people fall through the cracks. And it's both not desirable, it's not fair, and it's also not sustainable, right? Because you can't just ignore whole parts of the population and think that they're going to get away with it forever. That's just not going to happen. Plus, we don't want it to happen. So it's really the social change aspect that got me to where I am. That's also why we called it Sociocracy for All. And that was actually a working title in the beginning because we were talking about what our vision would be. And that was by email back then. And then I was asking, like, well, what would you call this, Sociocracy for All? And then the co-founder got back to me and said, like, well, maybe exactly that, because our point was we didn't want this just in the hands of people that would be more prone to governance systems, like one thinks of like boardrooms and all of that. No, this is like an everyday people kind of thing because everybody should be able to have access to it. So that's why our mission is also around making it accessible. So we don't want necessarily, or it's not that we want to convince people or persuade people, but I do want it to be accessible to people. And it wasn't as accessible before we started, in my perspective at least. So anybody who sits down and Googles, like alternatives to hierarchy, should be able to find us, right? And then have access to all the resources that they need. I guess on a deeper level, what brought me here is that I had tried and joined groups, but it was typically governance that drove me away from those groups. Like I was part of majority votes run groups, and that was just always dissatisfactory. Like I remember, for example, I was part of a group. What your committee does is, there we go. So I was a part of a group that put on a summer academy, and we were told, okay, you just get twice as many presentations or submissions as you need, and then you just vote, and then you kick half of them out, basically. And I thought, wow, but that's so nasty to be lining up great presentations with people, knowing that half of them are just going to go to waste. it just didn't seem like an okay approach. And the other aspect was that the people who would vote on it would not really have full information about those things. So the whole thing just felt off to me. It felt just wrong, basically. So I left there, and I had like a whole chain of wanting to be engaged in something and thinking that that doesn't seem right. So I was just constantly feeling out of integrity in things. And this community then was the first time I felt like, oh, this is actually what integrity feels like. And now we can start doing things without this nagging, voice inside yourself that says, this is not okay. Like the way we do this is not okay. And then on a very, very deep level, actually, something that I just occurred to me a while ago, a few weeks and months ago. And that is that I noticed, I think, so being German, of course, I reckoned with the legacy of Holocaust in my country. And what I realized as a teenager, I had a really profound kind of insight then. And it was that I read some statistic back then, and I don't remember the statistic, but I mean, obviously the vast majority of people was colluding with the system, right? And I was sitting there, remember that, sitting there as a teenager thinking, hold on, if the vast majority of people colluded, I would have too. Because I'm not a better human being than 98% of the population. I know that, I'm somewhere in the middle. And just realizing that we tell ourselves that we have a lot of choice and that it's all about who we are, but really we're so dependent on the system around us. And that's a really humbling thought to have, right? Of, oh wow, I can really be out of integrity if the system bends me out of shape every day. And that's what people experience, right? So it doesn't even have to go to fascism to get there. It's already in the current system that people are bent out of shape every day of their lives. And that's what systems do. So for me, it was Nazi Germany that got me to this realization of just how much power systems have, the ecosystem that we grow up in and that we operate in. So to me, it's about replacing those toxic systems that we are in to have systems in which both of us, we feel better about ourselves and also relationships get better. And that, to me, is really what it's all about. That's, to me, what the essence of sociocracy is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. It reminds me of Rianne Eisler, who has also been a huge influence on me. And I'm struggling now. I'm not sure if she's German or Austrian, but either way, her work on dominator paradigm versus partnership paradigm came out of how could a society have gone so far astray that somebody like Hitler was able to have the kind of power that he did. So I guess that one of the beauties of sociocracy is that it encourages those dissenting voices, the people who are going to go, hold on a moment, this may not be the way that we want to go morally or in any other way. So I know it's very hard to find any upsides to come out of the World War II, but it's maybe, several decades later is actually giving rise to new structures, new ways of doing things so that can hopefully never happen again. It does feel like that inclusion of people who may previously have been marginalized, not being straight, cis, white, educated, Western males. That's a very important part of sociocracy.
Yes, definitely. I'll give you one example that I find easy to explain. And that is just going back to rounds. If we speak one by one, that means we create a culture where we take it for granted that every voice matters. And that already is so counter what people typically experience, right? So even if we have a situation where everybody talks, the more extroverted people talk. Typically, guys talk more. People who, again and again in their lives, have been told that they get to claim space, right? Um, and even if then we say, oh, let's hear from the people who haven't talked yet, which still to me has such a weird flavor. I don't know. Something about that just seems off. I guess maybe it's because the people who talk more grant space to the others. I think that's what's rubbing me the wrong way in those moments. Anyway, but rounds turn that upside down and say, okay, no, everybody's voice matters, and that's why we're going to hear everybody's voice. It's so radical and so simple. And that's quite new to people, actually. That's something that they sometimes even struggle with if all of a sudden they're given a voice, and so that's something definitely people have to get used to.
So I'm wondering how it. I feel like I'm a bit of a slow thinker. It takes me a while to process. I do best when I have the opportunity to sort of sleep on an idea, and then usually in the morning I have some insights about it. So can sociocracy even help people like me who just need a little bit more time to think about things?
I'm so glad you're bringing that up. Yeah, because here's an interesting thing, I guess. Let's see. I hope I can say this well because it's important to me. Um, Remember, so earlier I said something like I don't want people to be at the mercy of a system. So I want people to be so well trained that they can take ownership not only over their work, but even over their system. So that means, for example, if sociocracy says do rounds by default, I want groups to have the tools to even override that by consent. Like, so if they by consent decide that's not what we're doing, that's great. That's actually more sociocracy than doing rounds because it's taking ownership on and being intentional and inclusive about how you do things. And for example, I know groups that do little extra deals. Like, for example, you could, if you make a decision, let's say you make an important decision, and somebody like you, like I tend to be on the fast side, so I can decide in the moment, that's no problem. But I know that's not everybody. So, for example, if somebody like you says, I think this is okay, I think I can consent, but I just want to sleep on it, we would just say, okay, let's say we give provisional consent, and by tomorrow, 10 o'clock, if we don't hear from you, we consider the decision made. You know? So, or for example, if rounds don't work for people, then whatever, you might have some person, like one person always go last. Or I once talked with an introvert that was terrified at the idea of having to speak in a round, and we found an accommodation that that person would always speak first. That way, he wouldn't have to sit through the whole round thinking, oh, and I'll have to talk, and I'll have to talk, and I have to talk. So we found something that worked, and that's the whole point: finding something that works. And again, then to me, the tools that sociocracy comes with, like rounds, like linking, and like circles, and all of that, and all the jargon that goes along with it, to me, are just basically offers that you can use by default, that are a really good way to start out with, and then you do what you do. That to me is what self-governance is. The only thing that's sort of on the other side is if people just make up their own thing, then we would reinvent the wheel over and over and over again, which also doesn't really serve us. So that's why I like this in between thing of sociocracy giving you a good starting point, and then you tweak it from there. So that's how I see that one. So whatever you can come up with to make it work for you, that's what you do.
I love it. Very, very meta level.
Yes, it is
Um,
very much. That's what people struggle with, and go, and then my role is to teach that, right? Then I find myself in trainings always going like, well, this, but also that, well, and this, and also that, like do always this, but never do that. Like it's just so hard to teach people balance because I constantly find myself over representing one side. It's a little bit like a kid's cartoon that I saw as a kid. Like if you're trying to make two cookies like the same size, and you bite a little here, but then this is bigger, and like so I find myself going back and forth wanting to emphasize. Are we back?
I, I think we had a bit of a Skypey moment there. We're back.
When did you lose me? That's the question.
We were after the cookie, and you feel like you're trying to get the balance just right, that Goldilocks space.
The Goldilocks, exactly that. And people are not used to that. People come to me wanting easy answers, and easy answers are simply not a thing if you have to figure it out yourself. So, dancing that dance between there is a structure, and please stick to the structure because it's going to help you show up in a better way. But also, please override the structure whenever your intuition tells you that this is not the right thing right now. And that's I guess a whole new level of taking charge, right? Not only taking charge of what you do, how you do it, but also how you change what you do. Like, it never ends, it seems. So it's hard.
Yes, and I can imagine. Now, I don't know if this is British or corporate world, or maybe the combination of the two, but I know that complaining about everything was like a major part of corporate life. And when people actually have the authority to change it rather than just complain about it, that's quite a big shift. And I can imagine that being a challenge for some individuals and some organizations.
Yes, yes. I'll
Big
tell you.
cultural change.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I have one little story for you on that one. And it unfortunately, well, I guess I'm going to put a few footnotes on it, but I want to tell it anyway. So in a sociocratic, like in consent, what we do is you either consent, right? For example, because you love the proposal. So if somebody has a proposal, you say, I love it. Okay, that I would count as consent. Then it might be that you say, that's okay, willing to do it. That we also is also in the realm of consent. We would call it like range of tolerance, but it doesn't matter. It's consent. You basically, you're not saying no, therefore you consent. And then there are the people who object. So in a teaching moment, what I did was that was in person, and I told everybody, okay, if you gave them a simple practice proposal, and I said, if you love the proposal, stand here in this area of the room. If you accept the proposal, stand here. If you object, stand here. And I thought that was a pretty straightforward activity to do. Yet one person stood outside of the system, and I asked her, so, like, what is this, consent or object? And she said, well, I don't have an objection, but I'm standing here because I want to bring attention to the fact that some voices aren't heard. You're like, okay, but right now I'm like, well, right now we're working on this proposal about this very specific thing. Like, where are you on that, right? And I realized that what she was responding to wasn't really the question on the table, right? She was responding to the decades of trauma of not having been heard and watching people not being heard. That's something I can't change at that moment, right? So there was nothing in the world that I could have offered her on the content proposal that would have changed that. And that's something that gets stirred up quite a bit, right? And that's sometimes tricky. So sometimes, there's actually a book called Power Under that we quote there, right? If people basically choose to give away power to make a point or to be in that complainer or like in the underdog position, that's quite a tricky dynamic because in that, like, if you think of my role in that moment, let's say this had been a meeting and not a training, and let's say I had been the facilitator, what do I do with that, right? It puts me basically into a lose-lose position. She can only lose, and I can only lose. Because what am I supposed to do? Like, it's like, okay, now you've stated your point, and now what, right? So I guess ultimately some people drive that until they're being kicked out, like because and then you've confirmed their point. So that's a really tricky thing, I guess, of just where does the healing go from what has happened all those hundreds of or thousands of years of conditioning, power over coercive culture. Where do we get to heal from that? And that's something that sociocracy isn't quite strong enough in, I guess, because it just levels the playing field, which is sweet, but that doesn't undo what's in our heads, right? And all the pain that's still there. So that's just something that we're very much aware of the healing needs to happen. I guess that's where the Joanna Macy and so on comes in again, like all of those other tools that we need to even be able to operate in a system that gives us equal power. Because not everybody is able to just brush it all off, right, and jump and say, like, jump into the system and say, great, now I'm an empowered human being, let's do things, right? That's unfortunately not how it works. I wish it would, but it doesn't.
Because humans don't work that way. So when we look at the timeline of where we are in human evolution now and looking to the future, I wonder what's your vision of the sociocratic future? What's your dream that we're aiming for?
Ooh, that's a nice question because I like talking about that. Well, I think so. Let's see. I think that within a few years, I mean, this is my positive vision. Okay, let's just like that's the disclaimer. But I think that within a few years, we will just reach critical mass, and I actually am pretty serious about that because what I already noticed is that in some sectors, like intentional communities, we have new groups forming, showing up with us and saying, sociocracy is what you use for communities, right? And we say, yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, that's what you do. And they're like, okay, great, we're doing it. And that is the sector that started the earliest, right? So they're basically ahead of the curve of everybody else. But that's just going to continue. And then contributing factors to that are, well, if you've seen it somewhere else, right? How likely is it that you are going to be in a volunteer organization running this way, and then you go to work and things are still, still the same there? So how long are people willing to accept that? That's one thing. So there will be spillover effects, I guess. That's at least my hope, and that's also what I'm seeing somewhat. So I now have more and more people that say, hey, I'm part of this group, but now this other group where I want to introduce sociocracy because it's working so well for us. Another thing is schools, for example, schools using sociocracy, right? And now if we get people early and they don't even run through the decades or let's say 20 years of being trained to submit to their boss, that's going to help quite a bit. And I also have a feeling that the generation after me, or even maybe one generation down, they are just much more purpose driven and like integrity driven than what I experienced people my age. So that's my hope, that people are that we reach enough critical mass, that enough people know that choosing hierarchical culture is a choice, and that it didn't just fall from the sky, but that's a choice that we make, and then realize, oh, we could also make a different choice. And as soon as we get to that point, I cannot imagine why people would stay in the current system. I mean, if people choose to do that, I will not know what to think because it would be hard for me to accept. But yeah, so that, I don't know, a few more years, and then some sectors will already shift. That's my guess.
Beautiful. So how old are your kids?
I have 5, so the youngest is almost eight. The oldest is 17.
Wow. Okay. So maybe by the time that they're our age, we'll be facing a brave sociocratic new future.
Yeah, maybe. That would be awesome, wouldn't it? There's going to be so much else happening too. They will need it.
Indeed. Bless them. So Ted, this has been wonderful. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you would love to share?
Um, I guess, let's see. If I could say a few sentences about how sociocracy for all operates, that might be a good idea. If you can use that somewhere, you can always just, I guess.
Sorry, I missed a bit there. About
If just how sociocracy for all operates, basically where we put our energy, given all of that, where do we put our energy and what's our theory of change, I guess, on what we're doing. It goes very much along with what we just talked about of projecting into the future, basically. So is that good?
so should I ask? Why don't I ask you a question about that? I'll just keep it simple. Um, so just to wrap up, then, can you tell us a bit more about how sociocracy for all operates?
Yeah, I guess our idea is again the accessibility piece, so wanting to give people access to this. So a lot of what we do is just basically advocacy and training and free resources, just getting it out there so people can get into their position of choice and can wake up and say, "Oh, hold on, this was a choice that we made. Like whatever governance system they're in, we could also choose a different one." And then the other piece is networking people, because for many of the people that find sociocracy, what's actually quite a tricky dynamic is that it's almost like they're starting to see and they can't unsee anymore. And sometimes I feel a little bad about it because I've had people drop out of my training saying, I don't even want to know more about this because I love it so much, and yet tomorrow morning I have to show up at work. Like I just cannot straddle. I just can't. Like so, and that threw me into a little bit of an identity crisis because I thought, hold on, I'm not in the business of making people unhappy. That doesn't feel right. And then again, what do you do, right? So many people tell me I'm spoiled for the world out there now. Anyway, so what we do with that is we connect people, right? So that they have that place of companionship. Like, for example, we have a group that just looks at sociocracy in sociocratic schools or in nonprofits and co-ops and so on, just so that people have a place where they're understood and they have that, yeah, just a sense of belonging, I guess, in that place. So networking is a big aspect. And a very big aspect is also just language compatibility. So, for example, we have a big group that is doing sociocracy in Spanish-speaking countries and so on, and just supporting other language communities, um, because whatever is learned in a different area of the world, right, can be useful somewhere else. So the more information flow we have between all the people, the better for everybody. So those are the main areas that we cover, and that's, yeah, of course, also Socratically run, volunteer members, a bunch of staff. So. And that's how we spend our time. Check, we say when we're complete on something.
Fantastic. And you can find out more about TED and the work of Sociocracy for All at sociocracyforall.org. And with that, it just remains for me to thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and your insight, Ted. It's been really fascinating, and I hope that your dream comes true.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.